Well, in Japan today, President Obama got asked about what foreign leaders gathered for the G7 summit were saying about Trump. Well, his answer, not surprisingly, was pretty blunt. Take a listen.
They are not sure how seriously to take some of his pronouncements, but they're rattled by him, and for good reason, because a lot of the proposals that he's made display either ignorance of world affairs or a cavalier attitude.
Of course, Trump, he didn't seem bothered by it. In fact, he embraced it.
If they're rattled in a friendly way, that's a good thing, John, not a bad thing.
A number of world leaders have already expressed some concerns about Trump publicly. Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron called Trump's proposed ban on Muslims divisive, stupid, and wrong. President of Mexico compared Trump's rhetoric to the kind of rhetoric that led to the rise of Hitler and Mussolini. And Germany's Minister of the Economy said that Trump's ideas were a threat to peace and prosperity. Let's see, not exactly mild criticisms there. Here now, New York Times Chief Washington Correspondent David Sanger and Danielle Pletka, Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Danielle, I'll start with you. You're at the remote. I always feel like it's unfair to not be in studio, so I want to start with you.
Okay.
I know you've been critical of Donald Trump during the primary season, and particularly on foreign policy. But considering that the American public's been unhappy with the direction of American foreign policy now for over a decade, through two presidents, why doesn't he technically have the better message for the voter?
Well, you know, I mean, I think the problem here is not a substance question. As you rightly say, I'm not too fond of Donald Trump, and I don't agree with many of his rather vague pronouncements on foreign policy. That being said, I don't think that it's really appropriate for the sitting president of the United States to go off to a high-level gathering and chit-chat about the choices of the American people in a democratic system with foreign leaders and make insulting comments about the candidates' choices. I don't mind if he comes home and he wants to do it. I think it's a little bit suspect when he makes that choice. You know,
Danielle, it's an interesting point, David, that she makes. You know, at the end of the day, former President Bush doesn't criticize President Obama. And she's right. I'm trying to think of when I remember presidents criticizing nominees while overseas. Is that a violation of the politics should stop at the water's edge?
Well, politics should stop at the water's edge.
I know. It doesn't work. It died a long time ago. I hear you.
I think it died with the invention of the internet. It was a little bit unusual, but I have to say, I just got back from last night from a trip that took me from Europe through to Asia. I was with Secretary Kerry for some of it. Was in Southeast Asia as well. And it's sort of overwhelming. It is the thing that everybody stops and talks to you about. And American diplomats all tell me they're struggling with how to answer it as well. And there is a way to sort of get at these answers, not necessarily by criticizing any of the candidates, but by observing that some of the proposals that we've heard from Donald Trump, and the one you hear about the most in Asia was what he said to me and Maggie Haberman about letting Japan and South Korea get nuclear weapons again. And people were coming and saying, you know, does he recognize that this would violate the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? That you're asking countries in some ways to go do that. And it's a hard question to answer because you don't know how serious some of these proposals are.
You know, Danielle, Hillary Clinton used the phrase urgent threat. I'm used to hyperbole in presidential campaigns, so on one hand, I'm not surprised. But it seems like that's a phrase that should be reserved for some enemy. Do you view Donald Trump as an urgent threat? Do other people in the American foreign policy community truly view him as an urgent threat?
I think a lot of us in the sort of grown-up foreign policy community are very unhappy with pronouncements about nuclear weapons, with pronouncements about Muslims, with pronouncements about Libya, China. I could go on for quite a long time here. But at the end of the day, you know, he's not hiding anything. This is not a man who's rising to power by pretending to be a really good, conservative, serious man on foreign policy. He certainly lays it all out there. And I think it's a little rich for Hillary Clinton to suggest that that's an urgent threat. But, you know, but what happened in Libya, what's happening in Syria, that's not an urgent threat. On top of that, I think it's important to be honest about how our diplomats see the regime of Barack Obama. Obama. Because, yes, people may be
Right.
extraordinarily upset about the choices the American people are making, and many Americans, people like me, are upset about the choices that the American people are making. But overseas, we have seen an unbelievable rising tide of unhappiness with the Obama administration, and we really can't, we can't ignore that. That's part of what has helped lead us to the place that we're at with two candidates who make us extraordinarily unhappy.
Well, Danielle, you actually were trying to, you helped transition. That was a question I wanted to put on the table. I'll put it to David, which is this issue of the rise of Donald Trump and essentially nationalism or native. It's no different than what's happening in Europe. It's no different than what we just saw in Austria. It's no different than what we're seeing in. So it is, and you can make an argument that the reason Europe's about to crack up is because of this migration crisis, which is because of instability in the Middle East, and da-da-da-da-da. You connect the dots.
That's absolutely right. And then the question which Danielle sort of raises up here is how much of this has to do with President Obama, and how much of this would have happened no matter who was sitting in the Oval Office? When we look back at this in history, Chuck, I think one of the questions is going to be, was Barack Obama an extraordinarily unlucky to be sitting in the Oval Office in the midst of the Arab Spring, and then what happened beyond it?
Well, I think ultimately we've now got 3 straight presidents that haven't figured out how to use America's superpower in the post-Cold War era. That's
right.
Essentially what we've learned now over Clinton, Bush, and Obama.
And you're probably going to find that the next president's suffering the same struggle.